correct, Barb? All right. So the first item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from May 14th.
I move approval.
Second.
Any discussion? All right, Imad, your advisory vote?
I'll abstain.
All right, all others?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Nay. All right. So we have three topics for discussion tonight. The first one is the major topic, and where I think we'll have the majority of our discussion, which is a first view into next year's budget as well as actually the year following. The second item is the school safety plans, which will be an action item on the December agenda for this group. And then the third is a potential policy update for our public appearance policy. So with that, Kelly, do you want to come up or? Great. And maybe just as these guys come up, the budget discussion we wanted to run in two parts. So if you can hold your questions, we'll stop in the middle on page 7 for discussions around the overall budget context, forecast, et cetera. And then the second half of the discussion will be on a more specific proposal around compensation that has been prepared. So we'll have kind of two sections.
I have not heard anything from James at all.
Oh, he was expecting it to be on tonight, so you may want to check in with him and see if you can get him.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't have any texts.
Okay, sorry about that, I just wasn't sure. Okay, let's start
All right.
in. I'll go ahead and let Kelly go for it.
All right.
Do it.
Okay. Thanks, everybody, for having us tonight. We recognize that just 2 weeks ago, we approved our 18-19 school year budget. So it's good to see you as we transition right away into the 19-20 and 2021 school years. So what we're asking for you today is to help put on your multi-year thinking hat. We're going to review the 19-20 budget timeline for you and also review the key budget components, taking a 2-year look and strategy at that, because any decisions we make this year for the 19-20 will help impact the 2021 school year. So we want to just lay out the big picture for thinking and future decision making for the board. After I have a chance to do that, we'll hand it over to Deirdre, who will spend some time updating you on our total compensation work with MTI this far and open up the conversation around total compensation. So ultimately the goal tonight is for the board to provide pre-budget input for our planning purposes so we can spend the next 2 months in planning time and provide directive guidance around the compensation components. Okay? Does that sound okay? Any questions or concerns with those objectives tonight? All right. So in front of you is the recommended 19-20 budget timeline. As I mentioned, November and December would be pre-budget guidance timelines. In November, right now, we'd be looking at total compensation, with December looking at staffing and allocations. And then in January, we would officially kick off the budget year, reviewing our goals, guiding principles together as a team, and any revenue projections we have at that time. February, we'll finalize the staffing projections and the workbooks. We always aim to get the workbooks out about mid-February. March would be our time to look at the healthcare benefits, and we will talk strategic framework priorities and any repurposing that might need to happen to get any previous items into the budget. April, as always, we'll have our draft preliminary budget, which we would release to the public to start the community feedback phase. Okay, so that's what you're looking ahead for the upcoming months. So what do we know about 19-20 thus far? Well, we know that our revenue picture has a pretty wide range. Our current law states a loss of $24 per pupil and aid loss. That's currently what's written into the law. And then a couple months ago, we had State Superintendent Evers at the time release the biennial budget. That request has a $200 per member revenue limit increase. So authority to raise taxes by $200 per school district student member. That's a pretty wide range. It's 2 different funding strategies and a pretty wide range from a -24 up to a 200. Those are the only things we actually know from the state budget standpoint at this point. Going forward, what we will know, or what we will be watching for, is that we do have a bipartisan legislature and governor now coming forward. So our tradition of getting used to seeing state information in February might not play out that way this year. We should expect a lot of back and forth between the legislature and the governor's office, and we may not have more information in February. It might be a little later. March, April, May has been as late as it's released. So I think having us all prepared to deal with ambiguity that might be coming from the state well into the spring should probably be something we kind of all mentally prepare ourselves for. On the local factors, we know a little bit more. We are in our last year of the referendum to exceed the revenue limit. So at the board's decision to increase taxes via the tax levy, there will be $8 million of revenue available for the district to spend. Also built into our revenue assumptions will be a slight decline in enrollment, largely driven by the 2X charters and our voucher program. So that'll be something that we build in up front. Finally, something we know now is our equalization aid. In the 18-19 school year, as a reminder, we lost about 10% of equalization aid. Because of the increase in equalized property values here in MMSD at 8.5%, double the state average, that'll have a pretty big impact on the state formula that the state uses. So at this point, we're looking at an estimate about 15% aid loss. We'll update that as that goes on and we learn more, but that's about where we are right now in our assumptions. So in front of you is a multi-year budget scenario slide. We know this is really early to be putting numbers on the table. And it is in no way meant to put the board in any corners around decision making now. Rather, we just want to frame the broader picture and orient you with a lot of the main budget components that is in front of the board. So I'm going to take this slowly because there's a lot on this piece of paper. And I'm happy to answer any questions once I get through this slide and the next slide. So first, we have the 1920 school year, and I'm going to look at that revenue box on the top green box. So I just mentioned that we have to make some assumptions around the revenue from the state. For this purpose of scenario building, we've built in a low end of about $100 per pupil in revenue limit authority and about a maximum of $204. We're assuming 27,000 full-time equivalent students for that calculation. And we're building in the $8 million of referendum to authority, assuming the board uses it for 1920. And then in 2021, you will see that that's a 0. And that's because we no longer have the referendum authority to exceed come 2021. So that's the revenue side of the picture. The $1.4 million in unused revenue authority from last year is not in here. That's primarily because the unused portion is a bit complicated on how you use it, and it's not quite revenue. You can think about it as a way we might solve a gap. So when you look at the gap at the bottom and the range, that $1.4 million can be used to help fill that gap. It's kind of a matter of semantics. It's just not quite revenue. On the budget components, looking at the blue boxes in the middle, we have a number of budget components that's at the board's discretion to make some decisions around in the next couple months. The first is our step-in-lane salary schedule. This scenario assumes that our current 2% lift on that schedule maintains, that no changes are made and no dollars are taken off. That's the assumption we're going with this particular example. The base wage ranges 0.5% to 1% for this particular assumption. The main reason why we picked that as an assumption is if you look at the prior year history, the board has been in that range, with the exception of last year, of course. And in addition to that, the current CPIU is 2.8%. Give me a couple slides and we can get into the definition of CPIU and COLA. But for this purposes, steps and lanes plus base wage together under these two scenarios could equal 2.8%. Healthcare insurance premium increases is in the third line in the blue box. Last year it was 3.85%, so it's kind of the range we stuck with. But this is the cost the district pays when healthcare goes up. We don't start those negotiations till March. That's because healthcare providers use the data from this year as part of those negotiations, as do we. So there's a lot of data yet to come, a lot of decisions yet to make around that particular number. We've seen districts around us in the double digits, up to 10% increases. We've seen districts around us down in zeros. It really depends on what our data looks like and what healthcare planning changes we might be willing to make. So there's a lot of room in that particular line. And then finally, the last line in there, the $3 to $5 million, it's kind of a placeholder. Every year, the district has annual increases, utilities, contracts that go up. And every year, we do have a discussion around strategic priorities. This is kind of a range of what where we might be in the next 2 years for those two categories. I think it's important to note that historically, for strategic priorities, we don't often use new money. We typically repurpose from within to fund those. And so that strategy is absolutely still on the table. I don't want to take that, I don't want to take that take away from this slide. It's just to give you a big picture of where we could end up at the end of the year. So the last line then is our gap range. To get to the gap range, for example, the $1.9 million in the high end of the gap range for 1920, you would take the revenue in what is like your best case scenario up there, the $13.4 million. And if the board were to make decisions on the lower end of the expenditure trajectory, the $11.5 million, we would end up with $1.9 million left. A lot of room to move with that particular decision. You could keep the levy lower, choose to use a similar strategy we've used in the past by maintaining that authority for 2021 in that particular scenario, or you could use it for maybe one-time expenses to release the authority for the following year. On the flip end, if we were to end up in the lower revenue scenario, the 10.7 million, and if the board were to make the higher end expenditure decisions, we could end up in the $5.2 million gap range for the 1920 school year. And then that same scenario plays out for 2021, where we could end up with $6.1 million gap in 2021, which is a range of which we can work with and have worked with in the past. Or if we end up in a low revenue scenario, high expenditure scenario, we could end up with as much as a $13.5 million deficit. Large ranges and a lot of decisions left on the table between now and then. We just wanted to put this out there so you could understand how the various components work together and the various decisions you have in front of you in the next couple months. The next slide is meant to be kind of a pictorial example of that scenario. So you'll see here the history of our revenue in the bars. The red line in the middle is that referendum authority to exceed. So you'll see that the red runs out by 2021. That then helps to produce the purple kind of translucent bar on the top there, which is exemplifying what the gap could be, depending on which expenditure scenario the board chooses to work with. So the expenditure line is the arrow. If we were to continue on the same trajectories, it'd be the red dotted line. The goal here, and part of the reason to start the conversation today, is what we hope we might be able to do is revenues are still going up, expenditures are still going up, but rather we flatten the trend line out just a little bit. So take us on a slightly different trajectory coming out of this year and getting us set up for 2021. Okay? So then the last slide before I pause for questions. This is just the way to think of the budget components and our work moving forward on a timeline perspective. So tonight we're going to be diving deeper in just a couple of minutes into the step, lanes, and base wage conversation. December, staffing allocation with a focus on the ERS kind of outcomes and recommendations. Benefits, we'll start working behind the scenes in January. Public discussions in March once those negotiations have ended. Strategic framework priorities we usually do in kind of the March through June timeframe. Okay, so that was, I know, a lot of information. And I know the board has a lot to talk about. So I'll open it up for questions and hand it over to Kate.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to kick us off, the reason we wanted to frame this as two discussions was first really to focus on the context of heading into a new state government situation, which has a lot of unknowns, and having a 2-year view with what the world looks like once the referendum expires. And you know, while there are many unknowns, the basic information is that we likely have some gaps to fill once that happens. And I would like to give the administration tonight some early guidance in terms of levers that we would like them to be working towards and assessing over the next 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, that we're all aligned we want to explore, and maybe if we can take some off the table that we're aligned we don't want to explore. And many of those levers happen to be on the page up here. So, you know, I think the goal here is really to understand where would we like administration to do more work to address potential budget gaps, and then we can dive into an area that they've already started in the second half of this discussion. So, does anyone have any questions first? TJ.
Is it okay? Actually, I have some kind of minutia questions, but I'd like to kind of big picture stuff a little bit first. I think that you know, kind of picking up on Kate and how this presented, I'm mostly looking at page 5, slide 5, because that's the meatiest of the slides. I think that when we talk about budgeting, we talk about, you know, many people say that budgeting is about values. And if we value something, we can find ways to sustain it. And whether that's compensation, whether that's how our schools are organized, whether it's, you know, if we're talking things like we've talked in the past about you know, possible savings from multi-age classrooms, doing something perhaps with pairing some of our smaller schools to produce some efficiencies around class sizes that way. You know, looking closely at the functions of, you know, our high level and second level administrators and NUPs. There's a lot of different places we can look, and all we have here is general wages. And so I think that you know, Kelly's talked about repurposing 2 or 3 times, but I think that putting repurposing options higher or sooner in the timeline to give us a sense of what we have to work with would be very, very helpful. Not to have that kind of be the last thing we do, but rather I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. So that's kind of one. And, you know, and then the final piece of that is, again, if we value something, we find a way to sustain it, and that encompasses the people in this room right now, but it also encompasses our community. And our community has shown its value for education with successful referenda in the past. And if we're looking at be it new programming or sustaining successful programming, or if we're looking at wages, that I think that before we start looking at cuts in any of these areas, we need to have a discussion of whether we want to allow our community to say, no, don't cut that, we'll fund it. So I think that a referenda has to be, if not this year, but I think as we look at the 2-3 years, that has to be part of the discussion. I don't see how we would be, I think we'd be irresponsible not to do it. That leads to a second kind of big picture thing, which was Kelly mentioned that we might not have state information till, I don't know what date March, April you said, or something like that. It could be May, August, it could be May, June, August. And that's something that we have to be prepared for. Last time we had divided government, this stuff dragged out, and it wasn't even as divided as it is now. So that's huge. The second thing is, which is not directly referenced here, but it's implied, is that one of the things that Madison has benefited from the Walker budgets, and I hate to say that, but we have, is that money has been done as a categorical aid instead of an increase in equalization aid. And when things go into the equalization pool, being a high spending, high property wealth district, we don't do so well. And so that $200 or whatever it is, or, you know, was $100 and it was $85, but all that stuff has benefited us, not in terms of total revenues, but it's certainly benefited us in terms of what we're doing with the tax, with property taxes. And Evers has not only indicated that he wants to put things into general revenue, but he has also indicated that he wants to get rid of the levy credits and reallocate those into into specific revenues. And the levy credits, Madison again benefits Madison taxpayers benefit much more from the levy credits than taxpayers elsewhere in the state. So in terms of property taxes, we all have to steel ourselves that the Evers budget might be good news for revenues. But there's gonna be some pieces of it that I think are actually very good policy for the state, but will not impact us in positive ways. So I think that just, knowing that today and not being surprised in March is important. And also not only knowing it, but also talking to our community about it, about why this is good policy statewide and how it's impacting us. So that's the kind of final big picture thing that I wanted to talk about. I wanted to zero in two places here. One is the $1.26 million unused revenue authority, and then kind of and you kind of said that that's not really revenue authority, and that confused me. And there's got a related question to that, which is that in the optimistic scenario, is the $1.9 million in unused revenue authority from 2019-20 applied to the 2021? So kind of two related questions about unused authority.
Yeah, so,
Can I ask one thing? Can you
Yeah.
please explain that in English? Because I have no idea what he just
Yeah.
said.
Yeah.
I can try, but I'll let Kelly go
So-
first, and then between
so-
the two of us, we should be able to do it.
yeah. And I don't want to get too in the weeds and lose everyone. So, we just passed the 18-19 budget, Nikki. And in that budget, we did not go to our maximum authority to tax the taxpayers.
Got it.
And that was a strategy to keep the tax levy under control and to maintain some board flexibility moving forward to the future. So, yeah, that 1.4 went down when we made those last changes, so
Right,
thank you. So, that was 1.26. Using it, kind of moving forward, is fairly complicated, and there's parameters by which we can use it and don't use it. So that's actually part of the budgeting strategy, which is how do we make sure we use that flexibility of which we saved. And so it just doesn't come in as revenue, meaning it's not actually like the revenue limit to exceed anymore. It's now more of an adjustment. And so it gets used more as a gap filling strategy. It's more of a reversal of an expenditure.
And then the second piece is that
That made sense.
it's
Okay.
the first year of this two-year budget, the optimistic projections show 1.9 million
Yeah.
in unused authority. And then I guess that the question is that when calculating the second year of that budget, the optimistic projections, was that 1.9 million accounted for?
No.
Okay, so the 6.1 could be thought of as 1.2 and 1.9 is 3.1, so that 6.1 could be thought of as 3.
Similar strategy
Right,
could hold.
But there's ways you can do it.
Yeah, exactly. We would need to, on the budgeting side, make sure we maintain some parameters to make sure we can actually use it and don't lose it, but yeah.
And the second is not really directly about this, though kind of indirectly. When we look at these figures about how much things cost and this and that, we had between benefits and salary, and probably there was we had about $3.6 million in salary and benefit savings last year, from budgeted to actual.
Yeah.
from budgeted to actual. And I guess that the projections here, what are the assumptions around salary savings that are being made there?
The assumption would be no change to salary savings, that the same formula would hold. So presumably the sum of the same salary savings would
So-
maintain. Now, it all depends on when people are hired, right? What salary someone leaves and what salary comes in. That's the reason why there's a range built in, because what we don't do, TJ, is we don't tell principals that they have to hire the person, at or below the person they're replacing. Some schools do that. Chad was just telling me about an example where they do.
That's why the dollars following the student is
Yeah.
not my favorite thing. I think FTEs following students is good, dollars is not.
Right, that's the system we have, and so we need
right.
to maintain an allowance in order to keep that system.
I guess we had, that 3.6 is much, much higher than we've seen in years. And so I guess that if we can track the assumptions with salary savings throughout this budget process, it would make me more comfortable.
Yeah.
I mean, Mike at one point tried to zero out the line and not use it at all, and came close. I think he had it down to $500,000 one year. And I just don't, it's something that we've experienced, and the reduction in that as a budgeting tool was actually reflected in the actuals for 2 or 3 years, but last year was really exceptional. I mean, last year was, and so it caught my eye.
Mhm.
So those are the two minutiae things. Thank you.
Yep.
Gloria?
Yeah, I just,
So maybe you'll cover this in future slides here, but I came in mid-budget last year, or this year. And we were talking about steps and lanes, and we spent a lot of time on steps and lanes, and I'm just wondering where we're at as a board on that. We spent a lot of time, I remember talking about it, and how we needed to look into that, see if we needed to change anything for this coming budget. And so if somebody could just clarify for me where
That's exactly
Okay.
the second half of this.
that is, okay,
Yep.
all right.
Do you have any other questions, Gloria?
No, that's it,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, to follow up on TJ's mentioning of a possible referendum to restore the tax levy for 2021, would that have to be in April of 19 to be able to do that? If we wanted to do that, would the referendum have to be this coming April?
No.
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 We could do it in 20 April?
Do it in 20 April, could even do it in 20 November, in November 20.
That'd be kind of late, because that'd be the year we want to start it.
It's been done before.
I know. So it doesn't have to be
I
this
did it
April. It
before.
could be done April of 2020. And then, but by then, that the budget that then would be presented to us at the end of April could include that, and you could easily anticipate it or not. So that's what, so we have an option to wait till April 2020 to do the referendum. So we could do it either, if we wanted to, we could do it in 19 or 20, in maybe even November of 20.
Okay,
Next November.
just a question, and I don't know if these rules still apply with the change in government, but can we only have referendums on presidential elections? Is that still, or did that not pass?
Did not pass.
Did not pass. Oh. Thanks, I just wasn't sure.
But we could choose to do it if we wanted to on November. So we have an option there. Okay.
And I just wanted, and not to dissuade you in this conversation, but just to remember, you're going to be hearing from the facilities team
in January, and we have been focusing on that November election for the potential facilities referendum too. So
Yep.
as you're thinking about all of your options,
November
don't
19?
November 20.
20,
There is
the
no
presidential.
election.
Yeah.
So maybe just a couple of questions from me, Kelly. The first is, we've assumed here a base wage increase of 0.5% to 1%, but we did 2.1 this year, and I think you said CPIU is 2.8 for this year. What would the gap be if we were assuming we did the same thing as this year, which is kind of fund CPIU at CPIU? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, so if base wage was 2.8%.
Yep.
That's $6.6 million. So
So it's
depending which side of that equation you're on, it's 1.4
basically
million.
add $5 million to the gap.
Yeah.
Okay. So it would be worst case scenario, $10 million this coming budget and $18 million the year following.
Correct.
Okay. I mean, I guess part of what I was hoping to get out of this conversation, and this is really for the whole board, is I hear you saying we've closed gaps of kind of the $5 million range previously. When I look at this, I see a possible trajectory that is very difficult to close without longer term choices around repurposing or kind of structural changes to some piece of how we're budgeting. And I don't know from the board how we as a group want to approach that, right? We increased our expenditures by 8% this year, and most people in our community don't get an 8% raise every year. So some way to bring the way we're spending closer to the 4% that we aim for from a property tax increase level, I think is incumbent on us to at least discuss. And so maybe going back to some of the things that TJ raised, I would really like to move up some of, maybe your request was move up in the timeline some of those repurposing options. I would very much support that. There's a couple we've mentioned earlier, 3 in particular from my side, and I guess honestly I'm just looking for if there's enough of us that we should go and do that work. But one of them is around multi-age rooms. We had 106 elementary rooms that are smaller than 15 kids right now, and if we were able to bring those up to our target, which is more like a 16, 17, there's probably a couple $1 million of savings there. So multi-age or doing more K through 2, 3 through 5 schools, which lets us balance out class sizes better.
I'd be for the second one.
The second one. And then the last would be evaluating whole school DLI, which could even out our class sizes a little bit better between ELI and DLI rooms, and potentially have some benefits from a school culture, et cetera, perspective. It's a good year to do that with the ELL plan, and that would obviously involve a lot more thinking around kind of the pedagogy of dual language instruction, but would be something that I at least would love to see if there's some benefits maybe, and also some financial benefits. So I don't know if there's others kind of maybe repurposing ideas out there that this group would like, that at least enough of this group would like evaluated. But I would certainly like to understand some of those. So I don't know, I've heard 2 people ask, so I think at least one more person should weigh in here to see if we're interested.
Mark me down.
All right.
Just a quick comment.
Yeah.
You said, when we talked about the property tax and the 4% goal, my read of the 15% cut and other factors is that that might be a pipe dream. That I think we're going to be looking at significant property tax increases
Going
well
into
beyond
next year.
no matter what, almost no matter what we do. And so I guess that's kind of my little introduction about the different state budget factors, was avoiding saying that quite so directly. But,
So
but that's
maybe-
my,
Maybe you're
that's-
another request to add then, the next time we have this discussion, to have a view into what kind of property tax increases
Yes.
we're looking for. And I think frankly, it's all the more reason to start evaluating some of the ways that we can close some of these gaps, knowing that we probably won't get all the way there, but that we should be doing the work to evaluate how to bring our expenditures in line with our revenues.
What I was just gonna say, and this leads into the second one, but my main priorities are going to be healthcare and teacher compensation, and those are the ones that I tend to focus on more. So I would rather not expand programs that are newer if we can use that for our teachers. That's my main goal.
So you're saying that you would protect healthcare expenditures and teacher
Yep.
compensation and evaluate all of the other options?
Correct.
Okay. Mary, do you have anything that you want to contribute?
No, I think, we have a lot of work to do in this district, and I think every board member is with me in feeling that the status quo and how we're doing is not good enough. And whether we talk about advanced learning, whether we talk about our facilities, or whether we talk about Black excellence, I feel we have to be looking at the long term, and certainly at the heart of any of our discussions is making sure that we're a great place to work for our staff. Part of that is compensation. Part of that is culture and environment. And so I think I see it all as a balancing act. I think certainly we should have any options on the table that look at how we can be most effective, whether multi-age. I don't know what the drawbacks are. I remember visiting schools that had multi-age not that long ago, and there's real drawbacks to them. But that's not to say that they couldn't be done in a way that, in fact, can address having the class sizes in a way that is the best use of resources. So, for me, it's too early, and I think the toughest things we struggle with, certainly I struggle with as a board member, is when we get to that point in April, May, when we know what the state aid is, when we know where property values are, and we have to make the difficult decisions there. So to me, the more options we can have on the table, but that support where we want to be in the long term. And I personally believe that one of the things we need to get, I'd like to keep sight of as we think long term is the facilities referendum. I think in the long term, we have to have facilities that are that support our students and support our staff, and we have districts around us that are investing huge amounts in new facilities, and that probably is not going to be us. Maybe there will be some. We don't have a growing enrollment, but that doesn't mean that every one of our schools and our facilities aren't ones that we're proud of. And so that's going to take, when you have 50 schools, the size of which we have and the number of students, that is going to take a significant amount of resources. I believe that now is probably that time when Madison's property tax base is growing, but you can't do that and do everything else as well. So that's where I'm at, is basically keeping the options there and being prepared to make those decisions in certainly the final ones in the spring, but certainly we'll have to make some decisions earlier with regards to staffing levels are the ones that come the earliest.
Okay. Do you want to add anything? James, do you want to add anything to this part of the discussion before we move on?
Well, I've been struggling to keep up just hearing everyone. Some of you talk so soft, it's hard to follow you. I guess the only thing I would add at this point is that people are weighing in talking about what's important, and that is important. I would only thing I would add at this point is that it's important that whatever we end up doing, that we keep in mind how the sector of our population for fixed income is growing, and how all the work we do impact that sector. And so that we don't get an increase in people complaining about being forced out of their homes. So we want to keep that in the back of our minds that, whatever we do, whatever decisions we make, that we keep that population in the forefront of our minds.
Okay, super. So I'm hearing three big takeaways. I'm going to say them out loud just so that everybody can say something if they're wrong, and I'll talk louder. So the first is to bring up a variety of repurposing options. Kind of your recommendations would be very welcome earlier in the timeline for the budget. The second is to take a look at and kind of keep in mind the impact on tax increases expected for next year and the year following. And then the third is, and this is built into our discussion for January around a facilities referendum, and to potentially we can talk about an operating referendum at the same time in terms of what that could look like, so that we can evaluate the choices there for referendum. Is that, do you need anything else, Kelly, from us in terms of this piece?
Let's get through the next segment, and then let's see how far we get. All right. Okay. So now we're starting to kind of look a little deeper at the total compensation. And this particular slide looks at it from the lens of an individual employee and what an individual employee in the past has received for total compensation. So this has been our history. The steps at the 2% I've mentioned earlier, base wage increase, which has over the last 4 years been the CPIU. And then the employee benefit to health insurance. Those zeros in the beginning are because we had some years of zero increases for the overall district. And then in 17-18, we did have some savings. That savings was then reallocated back to staff on the upper two rows. So that we have historically exceeded CPIU in total compensation. And this last year, of course, more than doubling it, as we've discussed. The gray boxes are meant to indicate the decisions the board has in front of them along various points of the total compensation components. And before I hand it over to Deirdre, we thought it would be good to put in the room kind of the little bit of confusion maybe between what CPIU is, COLA, and when we say total compensation, what we mean with those terms and those particular definitions. So CPIU is a number that's given to us. Like as I mentioned earlier, that's 2.8%. It's the package of goods of what it would cost an employee this year versus last year. It's gone up by 2.8%. COLA then would be the MMSD cost of living adjustment. So what adjustment are we willing to provide to the employee as it relates to the CPIU? So it could be that the board wants to make CPIU equal COLA. That would be a kind of the concept that the board might discuss. But for total compensation on the flip end, that is the money we give our employees. So an individual employee will move on the STEP schedule. They receive that payment. They move on the lane schedule. They receive that payment. And they receive a base wage increase. They receive that payment. Then there's the health care portion that the school district pays for out of any increases in a year time frame that the employee benefits from. So since health care is built into the CPIU total package on the left side of the equation, we would build healthcare into the total compensation on the right side of the equation. So in total then, when Deirdre, myself, when we talk about total compensation, this is the definition that we're using. Total compensation would be steps plus any lanes, base wage, and healthcare for an individual's total compensation, or we would say on average, the average total compensation package. So that's just kind of a frame of reference as Deirdre jumps into the next conversation, so you know the definitions we're using.
Yeah, so before I dive in, I just want to say I appreciate the conversation because we had grappled with many of the same things, and so it's affirming to hear that we're kind of in a similar struggle as we kind of try to think through this, and we certainly did so with our compensation committee as well. So wanted to give a shout out to that group in particular. We had a joint committee of MMSD and MTI folks that worked together. And as you all know, we started this work about a year ago, and we've continued on into this school year. Many of these folks giving up time outside of their regular workday to be a part of this process. So I just do want to acknowledge that group and really thank them for their dedication and commitment to continuing this conversation with us. So the most recent compensation discussions that we've had happened over the summer and the fall with our central office team. So our central office team did some preliminary work to really address some of the challenges that you guys were talking about as it relates to the budget, but also to think about some fixes that we could do to the salary schedule to better align it with best practices. So we engaged Bob Butler from WASB to help us through that process. And then we engaged the joint committee in the late summer to really share and give them an update on that information, but also to strategize with that group in particular around what is our best path forward. So some of the concepts that we reviewed by the joint committee really sit in two categories or two buckets. The first are what we're calling the fixes, and that's really kind of the low-hanging fruit. Those are the areas that the committee agreed should be addressed within the salary schedule. And then we have the second category, which is identified as items that could create flexibility in budgeting. It might move us toward providing more sustainability and would help simplify the schedule. So the areas that Bob was kind of helping us and leveraging his expertise and helping us think through included but aren't limited to things like narrowing our lanes from the current 8 to 4, moving the salary schedule so that employees receive a longevity bonus rather than the schedule kind of going on and on. And then also looking at a curve, which we've talked about in the past, to have higher salaries at the beginning that may potentially taper off over time. Any of these options can certainly be taken on their own. You can do some of them, none of them, but they're all certainly concepts that we reviewed as a full committee. So we would say that the committee has concluded the first phase of their work. And out of that work and those conversations, the MMSD budget team is wanting to put forward 3 scenarios for you. These scenarios essentially lay out the concepts and then things that the board can consider related to those specific scenarios. So we first have scenario A, which is simply to maintain the current schedule and only implement the fixes that the committee has agreed to. This does allow an easier implementation path potentially to COLA. It also gets those that may have been frozen or held in those incentive areas an opportunity to get closer to COLA as well, because they would be moving on an annual basis. But it does limit the board's flexibility in future budgeting. So that's scenario A. You have scenario B that maintains some of the features of the current schedule by implementing the fixes and adding lane movement on academic credit only, and sort of ending the perpetuity of the schedule.
Can you pause there?
Yeah.
The phrase, I guess it's the second, here it's lane movement on academic credit. On a previous slide, that appears next to narrowing to 4 lanes. And I guess that if you can explain kind of the details around what the difference between how those two interact or don't interact with each other. Are they 2 different choices? If you can dig into this a little bit, it would be appreciated.
Sure. So lane movement is really moving a person moving across the schedule, right?
Right.
And narrowing the lanes. We currently, the way that the teacher salary schedule is laid out, it has 8 lanes or 8 tracks.
Right, masters plus 6 and that's
Correct.
not,
Yes.
right.
So narrowing that to only 4, which would be BA, BA plus, masters, masters plus, was an option that was discussed.
Okay, so that's one option, and that's not part of scenario B.
Correct.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
Now, and then, but what is part of scenario B is lane movement on academic credit.
Right.
So it wouldn't be degree gained, it would be credits earned.
Credits earned that are academic credit that would allow you to move along the salary schedule.
So it would be, so someone who earned masters are like 32 credits, something like that, right?
Yep.
Regardless of whether they finish their masters, they would qualify for 32 credits worth, or we'd have probably some chunks between 6 and 12, between 12 and 18.
Yeah, as long as it was academic
Credit,
credit
right.
and not non-credit
Okay.
credits, if that makes sense. PAC
Yes.
credit is what we call it.
Right, so they could earn their masters or not earn their masters, and particularly when you get to the dissertation level, they could when you get to the PhD level, they could take academic courses towards it, and whether they finished or not wouldn't have any impact on their compensation.
Right, because right now, the way that it works, the academic credit, you can use that credit across horizontally and vertically.
Okay.
And so what we're suggesting, at least in this particular scenario, is that you would be using that academic credit only to move across, because those are, you gain a larger salary bump as you're moving across, and your growth potential is much greater than when you're moving down on the salary schedule, if that makes sense.
It does, and
Okay.
let me just, next time we talk about this, and this kind of goes back to the calendar thing, is that, we've got something new, we've got staffing notes to talk about in December, but I think we need to talk about this again in December also, and throughout. I think
That'd
one of the
be
things that we did
helpful.
last year, that was we did this and then we left it alone, and by the time we came back to it, I think that, but anyway, when we come back to this, one of the things that would be good is that there's packages here, and if the portions of the packages could be costed out in terms of savings instead of the entire package, to the extent possible. I know they interact with each other, but I'm curious what the difference in savings between narrowing and going to academic credit are, and conceptually I don't, there's nothing here that helps me figure that out.
So we will.
To the
we will-
extent possible.
Yeah, we'll
To the
take a look
extent
at that
possible.
and see. Yes, there are pieces and parts that are very interconnected,
Right,
so it may be
right.
difficult to pull that out, but we'll do the best that we can to.
To the extent possible.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, so that was scenario B. If I could move on to C, this is really what we would consider like truly a revised schedule. It's essentially taking scenario B and C and putting them together, right? So all of the concepts in B, in addition to the narrowing of lanes, the larger salary bumps, and implementing a curve. So if you were taking all of those elements together, this option, you can see the cost range there. While that provides most of the flexibility for budgeting for the board, and does implement, obviously, on all of the best practices that were discussed, it really would take an in-depth change management plan to implement. So it's not that it can't be done, but it would require a great deal of change management to be connected with that. And before I turn it over to the board to just have a discussion, I wanted to at least share that we obviously had much discussion around all of these. And while there wasn't necessarily agreement, there wasn't necessarily disagreement either. I think what was coming out of those discussions is the difficulty of wanting to talk about the salary schedule changes and these concepts in the context of taking dollars away from or off of the salary schedule. So our joint committee is more than willing to continue this conversation and do that phase 2 work when we have an opportunity to talk about how we can invest in a future salary schedule. So I just think it's important to put that out there. We had great discussions, but it was a difficult conversations for us to have with our joint committee when primarily, most of these, with the exception of scenario A, was really about dollars coming off of the salary schedule. So I'll leave it at that and turn it back over to Kate.
Yeah, thanks. I know it'd be difficult to attach numbers to what TJ was asking for, but that really would be helpful, even as an estimate, just to see a comparison, just so that we could get like a ballpark. Right now, what sounds encouraging to me is that this joint committee has a good working relationship, and it would be very difficult for me to support something that committee didn't agree to. I don't know if I could do it. So right now, if something where everybody gets a minimum of at least COLA, and how we are able to advance that in a way that's agreeable to that committee would be something that I would prefer. So if you're looking for some direction from us, I'd throw it back to you, and you've got a great committee you can work with. Our staff need to feel empowered in this discussion in a real way, and that's what I want to support. So I think with that as the underlying principle, A sounds good right now. Whatever else that committee can come up with, looking towards the future, and ask them. They'll help you figure this out. I don't want to be in a position where I have to impose something. Change isn't good that way. Change is good when you have an opportunity to participate in it and feel like you had a righteous say in it. Being imposed, the schedule will ruin morale. And we cannot afford to do that. I won't accept that. So that's my comment on it, as general as it is. But from this board member saying, stick with that committee and find the solution there.
The best way I can say it is exactly what Dean said, and ditto. I think we've had morale issues with their teachers for a while. We're working on it. It's getting better. I want it to continue to get better. I think if we change it radically, then I don't think we're going to get the trust that is needed from our employees. So therefore, based on the fact that, as I said, I'm pretty transparent on this. I'm going to fight for healthcare. I'm going to fight for teacher wage. Those are my two things. That's just me. I would go with A, because I feel the committee is respecting each other and working together better than they were last year. Last year it seemed like a competition every second. This actually seems more like a negotiation. And so that's the way I see it.
So I just want to, back to the steps and lanes. I just want to make sure that, we're not heading towards the end and then having to redirect our staff to look at something. I know I came in midway budget, but it was very confusing to me in that we were talking about steps and lanes. We wanted our staff to do that, but I just don't want to do that towards the end. I mean, if we think that is where we want to go, I would want to give some direction to staff to do that right away. And then also when it came down to it, we were also talking about health insurance, right? And so I just don't want to be in that place again. And whatever we can do to avoid that, I agree. I mean, it sounds like Dean said you guys have a great group of people who are discussing this and strategies, and would rely on them. But I think we have to be able to give some guidance to our staff on where we intend to go, so that we are not at the last minute throwing stuff around. So, and on scenario A, we are getting into a little bit of the steps, or not. We are. I mean, it looks like we're removing.
Yeah, Deirdre, do you want to go through those bullets on scenario A, just to make sure everyone understands what we've agreed to? Yeah.
So scenario A, when we talk about the annual steps, on the current salary schedule, there are places when you get down onto the salary schedule where people are being held for, we call it a 2-year hold. And so what we're proposing is that folks not be held at those points and that they just move routinely on an annual basis. So that is a positive thing that our committee agreed was something that we wanted to do. As we look historically at the salary schedule, there are steps that have been, we say, lopped off on that salary schedule. So when you look at the old schedule, there were improvement and incentive levels that were put within the salary schedule. And if you look at the current one right now.
Which is in the deck, just as a reminder.
Yeah.
It's in the appendix at the bottom. We might.
There are, if you look currently at the way that the salary schedule is laid out, a beginning teacher coming in at step 8 is there's an improvement level that is right after that. So theoretically, that person would have to, they would have to attain a certain number of credits in order to be able to move to the next level. And so what we're proposing is that we just move those incentive levels so that they actually make more sense, right? 5-year, 10, 15.
And that's what A will do.
And that's what A will do,
Okay.
correct, yes. And then also the removal of half steps. So right now we have half steps that are on the schedule. And those were designed for folks that were working a partial contract to move to that half step. And what we're saying is whether you're working part-time or full-time, you should be able to move a full step on the salary schedule. So we're proposing to remove that as well. And again, something that we all saw as a positive, and our committee agreed that that was appropriate. So those are the fixes that we thought would be good fixes going forward.
Thank you.
TJ.
Looking at scenarios B and C, the savings associated with B are minuscule, and the savings associated with C aren't terribly impressive. And I think that, kind of picking up on what Dean said, that if these become, if these are contentious, that those savings don't look worth it. Now, having said that, if there are ways to not do this, to make changes towards best practices, towards that are agreeable, that don't impact current employees' compensation, but rather put us in going forward into a more sensical situation. And so if scenario B, if there's things in scenario B that we could that you strongly believe in terms of this is a better way to do things, but we need to pump 100 or 200 grand into doing that to make up for the compensation changes, I think that's an option that we should be exploring. And in a similar manner with scenario C, that it's not the particulars here. If the particulars here are strong and the disagreement isn't about the changes themselves, and I don't know because I'm not at the table, you're there. But if the disagreement isn't about the structures, but is rather about how this impacts dollars put into compensation, then I think we need to explore them both ways. Yeah. And so, yeah, go ahead,
Yeah.
and then I'll continue after.
Yeah, I just wanted to share an example, so I can, I just want to know if I'm picking up what you're putting down. So in looking specifically in scenario B and looking at the longevity bonuses, we had a lot of discussion around longevity bonuses, and I think part of the challenge with that was, one, are they going to be significant enough? And two, like what should be the timing, right? So should people be getting those on an annual basis? Should it be every 3, every 5, right? And so we had good discussion around that. I think some of the consensus was around annual. And I think really the sticking point is being able to fund something that felt significant enough for people to support that, to be quite frank.
Well, I think that, if there's a consensus among the committee, as Dean said, that the structural changes are positive, and then I think that the board should be seeing that, and whether we buy it or not, I don't know, but we should be seeing that as an option.
Sure.
And the second thing is that I think that one of the things we got into last year was that, we need to see numbers with CPI base wage throughout this process, because regardless of the different ideas floating around about how CPI should relate to steps and lanes plus base wage and things like that, a position that I actually don't agree with, but some people at the table do, and I respect that. I think that last year we built a budget on a 0.5 base wage increase, and got, as Gloria said, things kind of caught us at the last minute. That was the big thing that caught us, as far as I'm concerned, is that we built it on a 0.5, and this one so far we've got a 0.5 and a 0.1 as a base wage. And I think that whatever context we have here is that a significant portion of our employees have a position that I agree with, that base wage is base wage and CPI and base wage should be aligned or close to aligned. If CPI is 2.28 or something, maybe we look at 2, but essentially. So I think that we need to see the numbers along the way, and then we need to, if we're talking about reorganization, reallocations, if we're talking about changing class sizes and things like that, in order to do this, we need to see those options, and not get caught with, telling a bunch of people that, well, steps plus base wage equals CPI, and they, and just shaking their head and going, not to me it doesn't. So that's my guidance, or at least my request for information.
Yeah, so, TJ, you and I do disagree on this. I think I'm all in favor of moving to annual steps. I think it's ridiculous that we operated for as long as we did with so many of our staff not seeing annual increases. And I think that's a large reason that that you couldn't ever make a reasonable argument that said steps and base wage increase are aligned with CPI, because nearly half your workforce wasn't actually even receiving that. And so I think getting to that annual increase, I think it just makes a whole lot more sense when you're talking about, okay, CPI is 2.5%, steps a step, and frankly, I see lanes as being a little out of that, because I think that that's something that's that's additional skills, knowledge, that is being earned. So I see that as a little differently, but I certainly believe that steps and base wage should align with COLA or CPI. And I think health insurance, I think everyone struggles with health insurance, whether you're buying it individually, whether you're in the private sector or the public sector. And what we offer is extraordinary to our staff, and translates into, for many, tens of thousands of dollars versus what they'd probably find even in other public entities. Of course, if we can continue that, I think it's great. But I think it's hard to say where that is going to come out. So I personally feel that in our planning is what we should be looking at with regards to steps and base wage is basically CPI, but looking at it together. And to me, anything above that is something that should only be looked at when we're able to look at what our other priorities are and the other things that we need to fund. I would not be in favor of increasing class sizes because of it. I wouldn't be in favor of unfunding some of our priorities that are going to move the needle here. But I believe that we should be providing our staff with a cost of living increase each year. But I look at that in terms of how they look at their paycheck, the bottom line. What is that bottom line looking at? And I think it's composed of both of those pieces, the steps and lanes and the wage base.
Yeah, two last things going to page 14, the 1920 next steps. There is some discussion in Ever's budget to increase special ed vouchers significantly. That may be a
Reimbursement.
Reimbursement, not vouchers.
right.
Stay away from that.
Yeah,
Never
Dean,
mind.
this, I
Yeah,
should have said that
nothing.
earlier. This is
But that's a
primarily looking at
possibility.
Fund 10, like our general
Yeah.
budget, and a lot of that funding would likely be Fund 27.
Yeah, we had-
But definitely watching what Tony puts forward for special education funding absolutely has an impact on us. It's just not necessarily like this particular piece of the pie.
Right, so that's something we gotta keep our eye on and a potential source of revenue. The other one is the first bullet. The two charters are expenses that that got imposed on us, nothing we can do about it. However, Montessori wanted to be with us. And right now, one of the reasons why I voted in favor of it is because I wanted that budget problem to be mine, not just imposed on me, that I had no control over it. I still think, and who was surprised that they went and got authorized on their own, because they wanted to run this program and they wanted to be public, but they still want to be with us, from my understanding. I think that that's a negotiation we need to open up again. And I would rather have that budget problem which was the reason why it didn't succeed, be ours, as opposed to be imposed on us, and we just gotta kick it out every year. I would rather struggle with that here and address it with a potential resolution that's under our control, as opposed to just letting it sitting out there and just taking a hit every year. So I think we need to consider that again as a potential way of drawing them back in.
Hey, James, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Not at this time, no.
Permission to
Yeah, go for it.
agree with some of what Dean says, with the exception of Montessori, which I think that decision has been made. I think that they have decided they are 2X charter. I don't think that bell can be unrung, and that's my issue on that. I do, however, want to know in advance what we can do and try and handle the special ed issues as much as possible. I'd love an increase. We haven't had one in 10 years. It is so massively needed that it is not even funny. So I am really looking forward to that, and hopefully it will affect us in a positive manner.
So maybe just to add my thoughts to the discussion, I guess, Gloria, probably worried about what you're worried about. I'm worried about getting to April and talking about a CPI increase of 2.8% in addition to steps and lanes, et cetera, which in the downside scenario you have here, Kelly, puts us with a gap of $10 million. And I don't know how to solve a gap of $10 million in May. And so I would agree that the scenario that we have here impacts every single one of our staff and has a savings of $1 million. That doesn't feel like a good ratio to me. For me, I'd rather look at some of the repurposing options that we talked about earlier. I think we have a number of small schools that have kind of just inefficient ways of using administrators. There's a lot of other areas to investigate that might impact fewer families, students, and staff that might have bigger savings affiliated with them, but I would like to have those conversations early. I really don't want to get to May and be looking at really large numbers with no options on the table, because the only options we have in May are staff, essentially, which directly impacts class size, directly impacts our staff lives, and working conditions. So I would like to have as many options early as possible that have the biggest potential savings with the least potential impact. But I also am hearing a lot of, we want to protect healthcare, we want to protect comp, and at some point the budgets that we're looking at here are going to require this group to make hard choices, and that is going to require us to be willing to have hard conversations in advance of being forced to in May.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I think I'm looking to you guys to how to have some of those conversations, but like it's on us to be willing to have them earlier rather than later. So, TJ.
I actually just, I think I've said what I'm going to say on the other things. I wanted, if we could go to slide 16, I just wanted to ask Deirdre some questions about the current schedule, just for point of some information that, so to go from 8 to 8.5 under the current thing, is that, how does one do that? How does one go from level 8 to 8.5 if one is that a 1-year thing, a 2-year thing?
Yeah, I mean, so those are annual steps that
Right.
you're moving down.
So
from-
the 8.5 is an annual step.
If you are a part-time employee, yes, it is,
Okay.
that half step is
Okay.
would be the annual step, and what we're suggesting is we shouldn't have half steps in there, whether you're working part-time or full-time, you
Okay.
just should move the full step from 8 to 9.
And 8 to 9 is an annual step currently, or is it a 2-year step?
It is an
Because-
annual step. When you
Where does
get
it-
farther down into the salary
Okay,
schedule,
that's
I want to
good,
say
good.
15.
Okay. Then they become
16,
2-year
actually, I'm
steps.
sorry, 16 is when we start the 2-year holds there.
Okay.
And so what we're suggesting is that those do not, we just remove those and folks would move annually again. So they would move 16 to 17 without that.
And
that
would 16, would 17 change then? Would 17 be smaller than it is currently?
Yep,
Okay.
we'd have to make those adjustments.
And
Because that's built in.
approximately half as much?
Exactly.
I
Yes.
mean, just,
Yep.
I'm trying to, look at the proposal with some numbers,
Yep.
in my head while I do it.
Mm-hmm,
And so it's at 16, I need to write that down. It's at 16 when it goes to 2 years. Okay.
correct.
And just kind of glancing at this, going at least, kind of, from 8 to 9, from 9 to 10, from 10 to 11, these all seem to be approximately about 3.6, 3.8, 3.9% increases when we're looking at those. Is that, and then they seem to be kind of start to get smaller percentage-wise as we go forward.
Yes.
Um,
Theoretically, when you are making a greater amount toward the bottom, the percentage growth becomes a little bit smaller
and
because it's
I guess
built on a
we-
larger base.
When we're talking about this in the, when we have base wage on this hand and steps and lanes on the other hand, that relationship is important, because base wage is just
Yeah.
flat. And I guess, I said I didn't have any more, this is really, I'm just trying to get information and understand it better. But I do have one more comment, which is that I think, as a general thing, I think that, upping the starting salary and starting at level 8 and all that, I think we've bent the curve about as much as is wise. And I mean, I'm willing to look at other ones, but I will look at them saying with that attitude that I think we bent the curve as much as towards the front. We front loaded as much as possible. So, as much as is wise, and just, you should, if we're giving guidance, that's how I will approach it. And, again, I'm willing to look at things and hear an argument, but that's where I stand right now.
Kate, just a couple things. On scenario A, limits board flexibility in future budgeting. What does that mean?
So it's generally just saying that these changes don't amount to any
Any
savings,
savings,
and
yeah.
so there'd be no way to allocate this money and to put it on base. The conceptual concepts going into this would be, if you adjusted the steps schedule, it could free up money to provide towards the base wage and like a reserve. But back on TJ's comment, base wage has a more of an equalization effect. Everybody kind of gets more of the same. It's an equalizer. Steps are not. Steps are a percentage on a bigger base. So the deeper you go into the schedule, the more money you're making, because 2% is a higher number on a larger number. So if the board's goal was to equalize this out a little bit more and to be able to provide more on base and offer more flexibility, you would move the schedule to a different schedule and take the flexibility and allocate it in a more equalized way via the base wage. That was generally the concept behind scenario C.
Okay. And then, just one more thing. So, just to bring us back to our previous discussion when I came in mid-year, it seemed as though we were talking about, this year we were going to do this, right? This was like the biggest thing, and then, but next year, we're gonna have to really, we're gonna have to tackle this, and we're not gonna be able to do much, right? That was the impression I came out of last budget time. So I'm just wondering, are we still there? I mean, I thought that was a critical year, that we are making this decision to, increase the wages, but next year it's gonna be totally different, right? We're not gonna have that flexibility, moving in future years. Are we, I'm posing that to the board.
I mean, my read of this is we are not going to have as much flexibility. TJ's commentary earlier is we're likely looking at significantly over a 4% tax increase without this, without fully funding base wage and steps and lanes and healthcare and the same class size framework that we have. That's my read of this information. So, and we can talk about that now. We will certainly be talking about it in May, but it is going to require us to make choices around how to navigate that.
If I can chime in on this.
Kelly,
yeah.
like that's my read of this information. So
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, Gloria, your question is a really important one. And to me, the most important slide in this deck is actually the one that describes the definition of total compensation and COLA. If the board, I feel that there isn't yet alignment around that concept. And if there isn't, that's where I predict we might find ourselves in some trouble in spring. So if we're building a budget around scenario A, which I hear a lot of support for, we support it as well. We think those are really important fixes, good low-hanging fruit. But if we are not aligned on how we're thinking about total compensation as it relates to COLA, that's where I just need to name it. That's where we'll find ourselves in trouble. So we really, what we're seeking from the board is clear direction. I hear the clear direction around scenario A. I do not hear clear direction and alignment around how we're thinking about total compensation. I know everyone believes, like I do, that we need to be investing fully in our employees, and we want to make sure that we're clear on what that means, and not finding ourselves in a situation where we're making promises that we can't follow through on or that we can't actually afford.
To me,
So I'm just.
may sorry for not raising my hand right away. To me, what this total compensation means is I want the healthcare funded, I want COLA. That's where I'm at.
So let me say that back to you. I think what you're saying is that we would treat it the same as what we did
Yes.
this year, which is right now CPI is
Yes.
2.8%, which would be base wage, our base wage
Correct.
assumption, or something to, right, that would be an assumption.
Correct.
Steps and lane is 2%, and then the healthcare would be a separate line item, and the sum of those would be
Yes.
everything that goes on to, you're giving me a funny look. Is that, am I saying it wrong?
No, I'm not trying to give you a look.
Yes, but I know what kind of cuts that means in other areas, and I realize that. And I'm probably the odd one out
It
on
might
that.
not be that bad. So I think everyone's in agreement with you, but I don't know if those habits of COLA and healthcare will significantly change much else. I don't think they will. We'll see. We don't know yet.
I don't, Dean, I'm not sure, because the slides here to me showed like we actually do know. We don't know finally about healthcare, but we actually do know more.
Yeah,
That in fact this does give us a gap of $5 to $10 million.
Yeah.
I just want.
Right, well, I'm fine looking for the cuts somewhere else than, and having those. I'll work that.
So I don't,
Then I would say I don't. You said I'm sure the board agrees. I would not agree to that.
Okay, well,
So
I'll
just-
be open to working that, as a trade-off. I'll work it somewhere else. I'll look for that, and we'll see where we end up.
just for a factual point that might be helpful, we're used to kind of working the system to reallocate or cut $3 million. If I were to go back to the graph right here, in 15-16, that's what we call like our equity cut year. It's the purple translucent budget there. We cut about $6.5 million there. That's the hardest budget cut this board has made since 14-15 at $6 million. So we haven't come anywhere close to attempting something like a $10 million budget gap in our recent history, just to put it in perspective of a range. That was a tough year.
I think these are clear, there's clearly disagreement, these are clearly difficult balancing things, and none of the scenarios are I think are very inviting to anyone. And I think that there's a real sense that in terms of progressing through steps of the budget, that decisions have to be made. And I think this is a case where decision has to be made via a vote, and that's how you get clarity. Because I don't think you're gonna get clarity from us sitting around bouncing ideas between us. People say a lot of things when there's nothing on the line. But when you have to put it on the line, that's it. And I don't think we need to do a vote in December, but I would think that something around, some package around in January, in preliminary parameters for building the budget, makes sense to me. I think by January we'll have more information. I think that we'll have time to explore some options and you know, put together packages. Mary used the word choices, with some choices. And then, you know, I think we'll pull it apart and put it back together in ways that find a majority. And that's clear, that's clarity. That's clarity. So that's my.
I just have a question.
And then we
TJ,
should
can
move
you
on,
just repeat, I know you talked about total compensation. Can you help me understand where you're at on that?
Where I'm at in total compensation is that I think that the CPI, that to include steps and lanes and health insurance and CPI is not how I view it.
Okay. You view it as
I view
separate.
CPI as CPI, and I think that base wages should increase something close to CPI.
Okay.
I'm not ready to go. I'm not going to go to the mat for full CPI, but something in that neighborhood. That's how I approach it. If there's significant kind of longevity and things like that provide some balancing on it, I'd be open to a little movement, but that's where I start.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I would tend to agree. I mean, for me, I think we got into trouble last year because we weren't pulling CPI separately onto the budget. And so I think if the majority of the community thinks about it that way, we probably should budget that way. And it's our responsibility to have a total compensation increase every year that is something our taxpayers and our community can support and absorb, and that it's close to what a normative kind of pay increase would be, right? So it doesn't mean if it all adds up to 8%, we should do that, right? That it's, from my perspective, I would want it to add up to, I mean, there used to be kind of the QEO offer, qualified economic offer, right? Where you kind of, everybody is in alignment that if we get to this number as a pay increase, that is a fair and just pay increase.
Steps and lanes were not part of QEO. They were separate.
And you are including healthcare, the health.
In the total compensation? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But I do think we should budget at higher than I think it would behoove us to be budgeting in the way that our community thinks about pay, so that we can see the full gamut of the options. So
Who's determining what our community
It's-
determines? Like, who is that?
so that, I mean,
Like, are you saying that there's someone, or you know?
this is the way that I have listened to us do it since I've been on the board. So that's the way that I've been thinking about it. It may not be that everybody thinks about it that way, but I do think it got us into trouble last year, the fact that we were blending the two ideas. So, I mean, we
I mean, I agree with TJ. I don't think any of us here speak for the community
fair.
as an
That's fair.
individual. I think that when we talk, these are huge dollar amounts, and they're not going to we can't just repurpose. So what it will mean is, I mean, when you look at the percentage of our compensation, or our budget that is in compensation, it's 80-some%. And then you talk about transportation and other things that are going to be hard to cut without substantially changing our operations. So yeah, I think we have to give that indication by January, because it's more than likely going to mean cuts to teachers in the classroom, and we are on a timeline to do that. That has to be done then, and I certainly am not going to be voting for cuts to our number of teachers, but I don't understand how else the budget will be balanced, and
it through
if people are going
programming.
to support that, we have to give that indication
I
early
see it-
on.
I see it through cutting programming. That's the way I see it. I don't see it as cutting teachers, but that's me. But that's my view.
I'm seeking clarity.
try one more time. Yep.
Team. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this slide might be another way to talk about this. So I think I'm hearing that TJ, possibly Dean, maybe Kate now, and possibly Nikki disagree with this concept that we've laid out in this slide, that total compensation, let's see where on the bottom where it says MMSD COLA 5.13%. This is what we're trying to figure out. Are we all in agreement?
I think we're just all
That-
talking about how the specific assumptions should live within that.
Correct.
So, right
Okay.
now we are assuming 2% in the top box, 0.5 to 1% in the middle box, and 1% in the bottom box. Correct? For next year, that was what was on the earlier page?
That's what was in the scenario
That
slide.
was what with the scenario
That's
was
right.
that we are
That's right.
assuming.
Which would be a total of, what was it in the bottom box?
A 2.8.
In total.
It would be the step plus the base wage in
Yeah.
that scenario would be right in
Yeah.
the middle.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm suggesting we use a higher number in the middle box based
Got it.
on CPI
That's what I.
and how we have previously discussed where CPI fits. That may not be what anyone else agrees with, but that was what I was
do agree
suggesting.
with that.
So,
Okay.
and I think we might be ready to move on to the next discussion.
I think that would be one.
Okay. Kelly or
Did we
Deirdre?
provide any sort of
Yeah, not
guidance?
really.
I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure. I think it's,
Scenario A.
I
we're
hear
gonna build
scenario A.
around. Yes.
I hear maybe meeting with MTI one more time to see if any of the
Yeah.
other kind of bullets are worth exploring any more. I'm hearing that. I'm hearing question of, is there more to scenario A that maybe isn't savings, but it's just good to do?
Kelly, can I?
I
mean,
hear
the-
that. Yep.
Just the first part of the discussion, there were 3 things that we discussed as well as options that I think are relevant. So one was around where else we could look
Yep.
for savings and to bring those up to discussion before January.
Yep. That's a takeaway.
So that we're not in the situation that Mary's laying out, right? The second is, and that may not add up to what we need it to add up to, but we need that information before we're making a decision on this. The second is, in January, we're planning to talk about a capital referendum for facilities. And if we want to explore an operating referendum, that would be the time to at least discuss that.
Yep.
And then the third would be to understand what would be the taxpayer impact of the scenarios here in terms of the increase that we would be looking at with ranges, understanding that that's.
Yeah, I understand those as next steps, I guess, as far as clarity goes. I don't know that we necessarily have the clarity we need around kind of the base wage conversation. I'm intrigued by TJ's kind of wondering about voting, and I'd like to explore that a little more over the next probably couple weeks.
Scenario A, follow up with MTI, and we're going to continue to talk about the assumptions that we're building in to the budget as it relates to compensation.
I would happen to show
Okay.
support for TJ in the vote, but that's my opinion.
Okay.
I just wanted everyone to know where I stand.
Thank you, Nikki.
All right. Should we switch gears?
That's good enough to
Okay.
get us going.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you guys. For
And
all your work.
there are members of the compensation committee in the room, so thank you to
And
everyone.
welcome back to you too.
Yeah, for your work.
You ready, Karen?
All right, members of the safety team are going to join us. Karen's taking a quick lead, a few minutes, and these guys are here just for questions in case they need to help. But I do want to thank Karen and the team. These guys have been working triple, quadruple time, I don't know, more than that even, on the safety work and everything that's related to that. So I want to thank them. All right, Karen.
Good. Well, thank you. The last time that we met, we gave you an update on where we've been, where we currently are, and where we're going for the school year around safety and security. And today we want to share with you, just give you an overview of our school safety plan table of contents. And then provide you an opportunity to give some feedback or ask questions around that specifically. So I want to walk you through on building the safety plan and what went into that, so that you gain an understanding of what it will come when it comes before you. What will you vote on and approved at the end of December. A couple of things is just to remind you where we've been the month of September and October. It's around making sure that we had safety plan, school safety assessments in place prior to building the plan. So we needed to do that first before we were building the school safety plan. So we are almost 2/3 of the way done with all our school sites. So that's a big undertaking for this team and many others to make sure that we had those in place. So in the meantime, while that was going, we also then were building the template and table of contents around the safety plan. I want to discuss with you, share with you the building, how we built the safety, school safety plan, kind of the comprehensive, what our design was around. Also, remind you about the required content, and then anticipated revisions that you might see that you might not be familiar with, just from the recommendations from the safety team. So building the safety plan, how we designed our safety plan table of contents and the safety plan, we wanted to make sure that it was just not based on requirements from Act 143, but it was really a comprehensive, systematic approach around what our district views as safety and security. It was important to us as a team and others to make sure it was very comprehensive. We also wanted to, when we were putting this together for the state and for our district, to ensure that we captured already our district strong policies and procedures already in place. By doing the school assessments and digging into lots of current and previous practice, it's very strong, and we wanted to make sure that our safety plan captured that. We also wanted to make sure that everything that we do is in one place. So for future reference, it's easy to it's easy to find and easy to communicate with our community on what we do and how we do it and why. We also wanted to make sure that there was a standardized approach, not just as a district, but in all our schools. So as our district plan, it would be a requirement of what we should see in all our schools. So there is part of that safety plan, there is required content, just to remind the board what it needs to have based on what is a state requirement. And also with the recent board policy 4147, that first, it has to have an identified safety, school safety team. So you will see that as a board when you do approve, that each school will have an identified safety team. There's also the way that it's organized is around guidelines, specifically around procedures around prevention and mitigation. So you'll see what we do as a district around those areas. Also with around preparing and also our response and recovery. So there's 5 sections that you will see. There's methods. There's also methods of how to review the process for the emergency drills, specifically around school violence events. So those are our lockdown procedures on how we review how they went. It also is required training around those specific drills. So that will be clear on that. If you just
Who does the training?
I'm gonna wait for. Let me give you the overview, and then we'll open it up for some questions on that. The other is identification of staff members required to receive the annual training. Who should get that and when, and by when? Anticipated revisions you'll see that may not be as clear to you or in the past, but making sure moving forward, and we shared with the board previously around some revised language around our current emergency procedures, and that is using from Code Red lockdown and active safety precautions to safety precautions to an outside threat, and that's the reason why we're changing that, because it's very hard to say, and then it's true. And it's going to a standard response protocol so that all staff, everyone understands, the media understands what we're doing and why. And so those, you'll hear the language lockdown, lockout, evacuate, shelter, and hold. Those are very easy words to remember, and especially during an emergency, we all should be on the same page. So you'll see that moving forward. And then also we will identified required standard training for staff and students. We've been consistently inconsistent, and by no fault of anyone, but just more, we need a standardized approach of how and who does the training and what that training looks like for our staff and for our students. So especially students with disabilities, so not just what we do for all, but then what in addition do we need to do for specific trainings for students that need extra assistance during that time, and what will that look like? We also want to make sure that we are providing guidance around family notification. We know that we have not been as consistent and as strong in that area, and we want to make sure that we are continuously moving forward with a emergency communication plan and really keeping things up to date. Where we are right now, we're sharing with you the table of contents because it took a while to get there to understand what that would look like, but we are in a really good pace to make sure that we are meeting the required deadlines. By November 5th, I will be meeting, and our team will be meeting with the police department to review our safety plans, district and school specific, so that they can be endorsed and approved by the police department, reviewed, and then we will be back we will be up again in front of you December 10th, so that we can share the draft and where it is and have any final revisions for from you.
We have to stick to that timeline by state statute. This has to be approved by the new year.
By the 17th of December, right. So we have a very aggressive timeline, which we've known. It's just a very big undertaking. So very proud of our team and our schools and lots of people helping. So now I'll open it up for some questions or clarifications.
Who does the training of both staff and students? Is it ERO? Is it a teacher? Is it a police officer?
So once we get these plans done, we will then be planning for the staff training, which will happen second semester, and then rolling it out for student training in 2019, 2020.
But I mean, who does the training?
The school, so there will be site-based, the safety team and our team will be rolling that out.
With regards to student training, do you see the training for emergency procedures and the response protocol as something different than just having a practice fire drill or a tornado drill? And what does that look like?
Yep.
That's a great question. When I spoke to the board a few weeks ago, our actual procedures, how they're written, are pretty solid. But how we drill and how we train for them is really lacking. And you probably know that because you've been doing code red drills probably for many years. And it doesn't seem like anything really ever changes. What we're going to work on and incorporating starting next semester is introducing some more scenario-based training where we'll give scenarios to your teacher and have a class discussion around what if it happened like this. And because ultimately our ultimate goal here is to make you could give you better situational awareness so you recognize when something's not right in your school and how to respond appropriately. And Karen mentioned the standard response protocol. It may be to lockdown. That might be the most appropriate thing to do. It may be to evacuate the building. It may be to hold tight wherever you might be. Maybe to shelter in place. We want to take and have people really know what these common responses are. Right now our emergency flip charts are filled with really good information, but you have to look at the specific incident to flip through there to figure out what to do. We have 5 verbs, basically, that we want to get this down to, but give you more scenarios in your classroom that you'd work through with your teachers to help not only prepare you for a day at school, but it could be the weekend when you're at the mall or you're out anywhere, just to make you a better, safer citizen.
Yeah, this is probably for you, Joe. But just wondering, I appreciate the transparency of the policies and how we respond, but I'm just wondering if there's any consideration or thought in this process about how, of course, we can't prepare ourselves for every scenario and every incident, but have we identified any areas that should be kept confidential that in order to keep our school safe, right? I mean, so that we're not.
Good question.
Okay.
Yeah, and there, at this time, we're planning on a closed session on December 10th.
Okay.
Specifically in regards to some of the specific details related to the individual school safety plans.
Okay.
Because I do agree, we don't want to put our strategy out there for anyone who
Right.
is seeking to come into our schools to do harm.
Mm-hmm.
So that is our plan
Okay.
at this time.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. What's clear to me with all this, and particularly in the table of contents, which is 9 pages long, and just the prevention and mitigation are 22 separate policies in here. So it's clear to me that the overall security of our schools are going to be relied almost solely, if not solely, but heavily on our own staff.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the length of this and the extent of it is overwhelming. We're going to pound all this down on our staff to now you got a document that's with a 9-page table of contents. One of the areas in here that struck me the most was the safety and security staffing. It's on page 3. And there's 2 areas there. It's the EROs and the school security assistants. The ad hoc committee made a recommendation very clearly that both, though, with recommendations about how to do those and how these things should be used, and since we only have like 26 security assistants and 4 EROs. This is a small part of what we're asking them But this whole large safety plan relying on our 4,200 staff, when we got 28 safety and security staff, their role needs to be clearly defined, particularly our school security assistants. We wanted to really review that, and in light of what we're doing here, what other things are we going to be asking them to do? What do we need them to do that they're not doing now? And particularly in the EROs in the 4 high schools is about this much of a plan that's this big. So I'm more concerned with how we implement this, and not so much who does the training, but the quality and the acceptance and the ability to set the time about for all our 4,000 staff to get this training.
Right.
That they're going to need to implement a whole policy that comes with a 9-page table of contents.
Right.
So those are my main concern is that the quality of the training, I don't care who does it as long as it's quality and so it's what we need. And also clearly define what safety and security staff on this page, page 3 on the bottom. What are these 2 groups? What are we going to ask them to do? Do we need more, particularly of our own security staff? Where they're mainly focused in high schools, but we got 50 other schools and 24 other buildings that we rent, and we got a lot of buildings with nothing except our staff in it. Relying on them to know exactly what to do if something really strange happens that maybe you got the training for, but it was a year ago and you don't remember, and things are popping and it's intense, and you got to make a quick decision. That's the difficult thing to have happen, and we all have concern about that.
Dean, let me respond to you this way. First of all, thank you for your observation, and I mean, it is an unbelievable amount of items that are laid out here, but this is truly a comprehensive safety plan. It really is. And you know, there was a lot of things when Act 143 got enacted, we went, oh my gosh, and you know, when I've talked to different parent groups out in the community, everybody thinks it's about the money. It's really about so much more. And I tell you the thing that I think we were able to do, this lady here got us all together, started meeting on Monday mornings back in late March, and that's continued to roll this year. But we've really done a kind of not just these site assessments that we're doing right now and finishing up at the schools, but we're really undertaking a comprehensive assessment and evaluation of ourselves and everything we do. I mean, just to look at all these different policies that the BOE already has in place around prevention and mitigation, okay? And really what we're doing is packaging this in a comprehensive way to really reassure to our staff, we've got a lot of great pieces here in place at the Madison School District. But I don't think, you know, we pass these things onesie twosies here and there, but when you look at them as a comprehensive picture, it really is pretty impressive in terms of what we do. Yes, through this, we're looking at those EROs, absolutely, but the security assistance, that's the next thing. I think you're spot on, Dean, that I need to do an assessment. I've worked with them now for a little over a year. I know what our strengths and weaknesses are. I know what their dreams and aspirations are, our staff, and the roles that they would like to see playing in our school. One step at a time here, we will get there. This lady right here, she's going to keep us on task and organized, trust me. There's a lot of work to be done, but I actually think that, and I mentioned this to Jen, I actually think it's empowering because to really kind of see this and go through this assessment that we're doing right now inside and out is very healthy.
TJ.
Kind of 3 things picking up on things that people have said and moving them in a slightly different direction. I think also in addition to the security assistance, that we do have this creation of the required school-based safety teams, and I think that taking leadership role in training, implementation, and things like that, I think that those roles will be critical, and that has to be emphasized, and that the responsibilities are there, and we need to do that right. Second thing is also, you know, Joe referenced that we have this comprehensive, we have all these policies in place, but they're not, you know, we do one this month and the other, you know, 3 years ago and things like that. And I guess one of the things is that should we anticipate some suggested revisions for aligning these policies with each other and making them more making them work together better. And I know that that's a lot of review, Matt. I look at that list, but I think that it might be worth it just to make sure that every policy puts us on the same page and that they reinforce each other rather than contradict each other, or create tensions between, or if they're tensions, they should be good tensions. And then the final thing is also a policy thing, which is more direct, which is, I think it's 4147 in the language, or the language around prior warning. And given the recent events and my understanding from public statements, both at meetings and in the newspapers, that we are committed to age-appropriate prior warning around these, yet our policy says no prior warning. So if we can fix our policy very quickly, if we can make that a priority, because the language says at least twice annually without prior warning, the principal or administrator of a school building or facility shall drill all schools in the proper method of evacuation and other appropriate actions in response to a school safety incident. It says no prior warning, and I understand that's not our practices, and it's always good to align practices with policy or policy with practices. So if we can prioritize getting that aligned. Yeah.
Yep. Let me jump in, Ahmad. Just to follow on the safety team, the school-based safety team, can you guys talk a little bit about how you're thinking about roles and who exactly is participating on those?
I can speak a little bit to it. The 4147, I believe it is, right at the very, it lays out who the representatives are, but some of the things that besides your normal people you would think of, your principal, any assistant principals, deans, students, but we also have community members, and then outside that, law enforcement, Madison Fire Department. So the principal has some leeway. There's some recommended players that have to be part of that, but it's laid out in policy. I think the big thing for me, what the safety teams do, is that they're a leadership tool for the principal. There's one thing that we do through these assessments that we do, and Karen, I think, was very smart about how she set this up. We use a process that was done up in the eastern part of the state by the Wisconsin School Safety Coordinators Association, and they got a very good process, but Karen, having been a principal at Emerson for so many years, she wanted to really make sure that when we went into that assessment and left it, that we empowered the principal so that they really knew what their strengths were, and then immediately what are the things I can do tomorrow in the next 6 weeks, and what's more long-term that I'm going to need some help with to get done here. And that's really those safety teams is really putting that principal in a leadership role around safety in their schools. That is so critical. And to see that leadership get demonstrated through the safety committees is only going to help us in the day we have a critical incident at the school and they need to take charge and be recognized as a leader of their school.
So, I mean, I think the leeway in there, I'd be curious as we actually lay this out to push kind of what is our recommended group structure, given that there is some leeway around, I think, community members and other staff members like custodians, et cetera. And I would expect there's some variability across the district in who's actually serving and how frequently they're meeting, et cetera. I would love just your take on what's actually recommended.
What is it, the policy, meet once quarterly?
Minimum.
Minimum, yeah.
I think it's once per semester minimum.
Yep. That's the minimum.
Yep.
And then the second question was just around technology. I know we had been exploring some direct text or call systems. Do we expect any of that to live in this document, or is that a longer term?
Longer term.
Okay.
We feel like we're probably going to revisit and revise going into next year. You know, it's just getting the base plan there, letting safety teams kind of understanding, start to dive into it, and then seek some additional feedback for potential revisions going into next year.
Okay. Ahmad, did you have a question?
Yeah. I just had a question on parent communication. Have we looked into other ways to effectively communicate to parents besides students maybe taking home a packet with them? I know a couple years ago we tried that with the behavior education plan. And oftentimes that kind of created transparency issues later on. I wonder if there's a way to evaluate that as well.
Yes. we're going big or going home, so yes, we need to.
Okay. I just think I'm not necessarily anything in mind, but I just think placing like the burden on the students to transmit that information to their parents can be faulty.
Correct, and right now it's really school-based on how that is filtering to the families, and we want to make sure that we're providing enough tools or resources that are standard across the district. Letters are different right now, and when things occur, and we want to make sure that there's a lot of different methods to communicate. And also, though, what's around the standard response protocol, so if you have a chance to look online on that, it's really easy, clear, friendly materials. Yeah, and materials that are not heavily, heavy language on there for families, and also the standard response protocol. They already have materials already placed. It is also translated in different languages as well, and so I'm very excited for this. I wish I had this when I started, when I was my first year as a principal. You don't go to school for this kind of stuff. And so we want to make sure that we're providing this training to our staff, because everybody, Dean, you talked about, like, who's going to help with this training? It's like we all are committed to safety and security in our district, all staff. It's a responsibility of everyone.
James, do you have any comments?
Not at this time, no.
Okay, thanks. Gloria does.
So the, just in response to TJ's, the notification of parents, what is, I'm conflicted on this, right? Because, what, is there best practice on whether to notify or not?
Yeah, I'll listen to you and then I'll.
First of all, it all dependent upon the incident that happens at a school. And, we need about 10 to 15 minutes most times to really figure out what's going on there. And if it's something that rises to the level that we need to get a notification out there,
Joe, I think you may be answering a different question.
I'm sorry, the notification
You're talking about
of a
prior
drill.
warning of a drill.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Yeah, I mean, definitely it's age appropriate when students and staff and also families are notified. It's very dependent upon that, and it's also dependent upon how ready we are for that kind of, if you're talking about, like a lockdown, that is not standard across our district on the type of training that we provided. If you think about a fire drill, we don't notify on fire drills.
Right.
Because we all grew up with it. We know exactly how it goes. We didn't grow up with lockdowns. This is new to a lot of people. And so we want to make sure that we are taking the right amount of time to provide enough training. And then when we feel that we're in a really good place, we then might go into an unannounced. But I'm not for going to unannounced at this time without making sure that our students and staff and families are clear. I don't want to cause unnecessary stress and trauma for kids until we're ready.
And so, are there discussions about what the best practice is to ensure the response, appropriate response?
The National Association of School Psychologists and NASRO heavily recommend you do not do armed assailant drills.
Okay.
Never.
Yeah.
You just don't. However, there are other types of drills we can do that are not the active shooter type of situation.
Okay.
We've got just situations that happen in the school in a hallway. It could be a large disturbance, and how do we take and go through a scenario around that, and what's our protocol going to be, and actually train on them. We really don't do that kind of scenario-based training, I call it, Gloria, right now within our schools. In fact, when we do Code Red, it's all, even our Code Red procedures are all written pretty much for the active shooter kind of event. But truth be told, if you had to do a lockdown or some type of scenario like that in your school, it's probably not going to be an active shooter. It's going to be some other serious threat inside the school that causes you to do that, similar to Mirror last year when the person ran in the gym.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, any other comments on this topic? No? All right, thank you. We will look forward to seeing the full draft momentarily. All right, last but not least, we have discussion of Board Policy 1222, public appearances.
I
Can
see
somebody
everyone
do
left
something
me.
about the temperature in here also?
You're left us
Yeah,
behind this
pretty
one.
lonely up here now.
Barb turned it down before.
Oh my God, it's like 1,000,000 degrees in here. Sorry, go for it, Matt.
Okay.
Let's make it quick.
Thank you for the intro. We are here to discuss Board Policy 1222, which is public comment. I have drafted some possible revisions here. And what those revisions are is that if there is a situation where there are more than 20 speakers signed up to speak during public comment, our normal time limit of 3 minutes would be reduced to 2 minutes. That's the basic concept. There's a few other revisions that I also made in the draft policies that were provided to you that were what I would call cleanup, just to make the policy stronger. So for example, the language regarding accommodations for individuals with disabilities was separated out. That was previously somewhat embedded in other sections, so we highlighted that section just to bring more attention to it and its availability. And the other clarifying provision is that if there are 2 periods of public comment, our last regular board meeting would be a good example. There was a public hearing on the budget, and then there was the typical public comment period. So if there are 2 periods of public comment, an individual could speak twice, once at the, the example I used, once at the budget and once during public comment. Just by way of a little bit of background on the going from 3 to 2, I do believe that it is a content neutral revision, meaning that it would affect everyone the same. A speaker who wants to speak on topic A is affected the same as a speaker who wants to talk on topic B. The other factor I think that is worthy of note is that I did review a number of other boards' practices, and it seems that between 2 and 5 minutes is the sweet spot. It seems like most boards have 2 to 5. So at 3, we're kind of in the middle there, and we're still within the range of what other boards deem acceptable. There are a number of other practices that boards have, but in terms of, in relation to what's the possible revisions tonight, I just wanted the board to be aware that that was within the realm of typical board public comment.
Thank you, Matt. Vicki?
I will openly admit I worked with Matt and TJ to discuss this, and I originally was for the 2 minutes. That was an original, because I thought that I could get more people and more opinion on the topics and to hear more points of view, and that was my reason for it. However, after talking a lot to a large number of community members and realizing my own bias, i.e. I speak very fast and I'm a trained speaker, both of which means I could fit more in 2 minutes than the majority of people can, I realized I'm asking for something that might be burdensome to a lot of people. And therefore, I'm switching back to the 3 minutes. And the main reason I am is because people are saying we can't get our message out, then we're supposed to allow public comment, and it's supposed to be clear, and therefore, I have to switch to the 3 minutes, and I apologize if I wasted any of your time.
I think I agree that if the issue is divisive and there's people speaking on both sides pretty evenly, then the 2 minutes is pretty neutral, doesn't affect either side. But if we're looking at, I'll just take where the majority, almost not all of the speakers were on one side of the issue, there might be an issue where we're attempting to silence them, even though that's not our intention. And I just don't want to create any more clashing at those meetings, regular meetings.
I don't even.
Yeah, I was open to discussing this, but I didn't really land on it. I think 3 minutes is fine. If in the 6 years I've been on the board, we've had less than 5 meetings where we had a large number of speakers show up, and then we had an unfortunate incident that was awkward and uncomfortable, and we can change our security procedures around our meetings to accommodate for that problem. I don't think this is a solution to that problem. I think it's I think a lot of I think if you're saying 2 to 5 and we're on 3, I'm fine with 3. And if we have a large number of people come to speak on an issue, it's important. This is local government. We like that. I like that. I want to hear what they have to say, and I want it on public record. And 3 minutes is still not a whole lot of time. And if it runs long, and we feel we need to adjourn and finish the meeting later, that's on us, that we get elected for that. We can finish our meeting the next day or 2 days later like we did if it runs extremely long. But it just hasn't happened. It's just, I don't think this is a problem. We had one awkward, uncomfortable situation develop, and we can handle that a different way than this. I think we should just withdraw this. Stay with 3 minutes.
Yeah, I really asked the administration to look at various things, and Dean, it's not at all about what happened last month, and in fact, this was on the agenda under a special meeting the prior month, and was only withdrawn because it wasn't following board policy as to how it would come to the board. So this has nothing to do with what happened last month. I also asked Matt and wanted to know how other districts look at this. And there's plenty of districts that limit time to an hour, limit the speaking to only those items on the agenda. I thought both of those were things I would not support, because I think that they do cut into people's ability to share their thoughts. And we've had lots of we have speakers who frequently come and don't speak on a topic on the agenda, but something that's important to them and really urgent, and I'm glad that we get those speakers. My concern is that when we're getting into 2 hours of public comment, that one, people who do come to speak have a hard time necessarily staying an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours to be able to do that. And in addition, I've seen for 3 straight months prior to last month that we're having a hard time actually getting the board discussion under topics that are really important to us. In the past, and in those months, we actually had light agendas. And as we get into topics that really need to have that full discussion, or we have a lot more meaty topics on the agenda, I am concerned that we're able to conduct the business of the board in a way that has that type of focus. After 2 hours, 2.5 hours of public speaking, people's energy and brain power is diminished. You can visibly see it, and I think when we have that number of speakers, we have seen that there's a lot of repetition, and 3 minutes, or 2 minutes, even for those who are not fast speakers, is a fair amount of time. We are going to tighten up the procedures so that people have a better view of the clock and know the timing. But I think that this is reasonable. I think it compromises our ability to do our business, but still to make sure that we hear public comment from everyone. And so I think that I'm just looking not at how we can do the business of the board and still have a very open and welcoming environment to people coming for public comment. I think it is critical that we hear from the public and that we have an environment where everyone feels that not only they will be heard, but that it is an environment where they can take the time out of their schedule to come and share their thoughts with us.
I appreciate the desire to preserve energy and concentration for the business of the board. And I think if we were to impose new limits on public speaking, that this is a very good way to do it, and appreciate the work that Matt put into it. Like you, the straight out time limit and sticking things to agenda are not appealing to me. I think, limiting pre-registrations and things like that, there's a whole set of tools we could have used, and I think that if we were going to do it, this isn't a bad tool. However, among the board, I probably am unique in that I use public testimony to speak to this body as not a member of this body, probably at least 50 times, probably over 100. Barb could count it up. I've stood at that podium a lot. And I know that when you have a complex agenda, maybe a single item is complex. Maybe there are half dozen items. And 3 minutes is often not efficient, not sufficient. Additionally, I see it as, it's hard to differentiate between people who have rich contributions and people who are being repetitious. And I fear we will lose the one. Finally, we have a tool already. Section 13 of the current policy is a tool by which we can limit. The difference between this tool and the one being proposed is that one being proposed kicks in automatically. This one, the people limiting time have to take a vote in front of the people whose time are being limited. And to me, that's accountability of public officials. If we have a meeting with 40 people signed up, we can take a vote and say 2 minutes. We have that ability. So I'll be voting against.
So, I like Nikki. I actually was in agreement with this initially, but after giving some thought, as Dean said, I think, we're elected officials. We're here to hear from our constituents, our community, and I think we have to be able to be here and present until we hear public testimony. I think that is the most important part of this job. If I am not hearing from the public to inform our decision-making, and 2 to 3 minutes, I just don't want to change. I don't want to limit that public testimony. I think it's so important for us to have. And so, I'm glad we're having this discussion, but I think I'm going to not vote for reducing the amount of public comment.
James, do you have anything to add?
I don't know what to say at this point. I couldn't hear really what TJ was saying.
Sorry.
So this is difficult trying to listen this way. So I'm not going to weigh in at this point. I think there's value to having this conversation. There's value to thinking about how we can have better meetings, but it's important also to get public comment. So I need to digest what everyone has said before I really weigh in on it.
Okay.
Any more than that.
All right. Thanks, James. I mean, Gloria, maybe I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's our job. And sometimes it's long, and certainly I sometimes feel more tired on some nights than others. I'm also incredibly impressed with the number of people that have been speaking recently, and really encouraged by the kind of civic engagement. I might not agree with everyone that comes and testifies, but I am so proud that we have a community where people are willing to take their Monday nights and come and talk to us again and again sometimes. So it gives me hope for the future. But
given what appears to be consensus around this table, I don't think this has to be forwarded to the board for a vote. I just want to put that out there. I mean, I don't know what you have to say about that, Matt, but
I think we should just wrap it up. We're at 7:20 right now.
We
still have another meeting to go.
I'm saying you don't have to put this on the regular board agenda.
Can we put a version with the cleanups on? Because since Matt put the work into the cleanups and just we might as well do,
but not the
right?
changes.
Yeah, 1,
Okay.
2,
And
Well, I mean,
just-
there's a few changes.
5, and 11.
3.5.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean,
That's
you know,
fine.
let's do the cleanup since we've done it.
Right.
Sure. Okay, so with the exception of the moving 3 to 2, the other paragraphs where, again, good way to describe it, the cleanup, would be moved forward to the regular board meeting for vote.
Yeah, that's fine.
Also, one section on 13, I believe. I apologize, I did not see your hand, TJ. And
No, I was stretching. That's
I think one section on 13 suggests that there be time limited to public forums. I don't know if that's still in there. I think it was in one of the original drafts. I don't know if I took it out or not. If
I don't think it is.
it's not in there,
I don't
never
think
mind, then disregard.
Okay.
All right. I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Sorry, Ahmad. All right, you're in favor. Any opposed? No. All
Thank you,
right,
Matt.
we are adjourned. Second meeting.
We have another
get
meeting
right into
to
it.
get started.
May we have 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work on it. Thank you.
Calling this meeting to order. Special meeting of the Board of Education Open Session Workshop. The topic is the proposed climate survey power questions. And so we've been through this a number of times. We're just going straight to the slide number 4, which is up there. And I'd like to just go around the room, and the safety questions have already been approved.
Yeah.
So what we are looking at is these. We're not adding any. We've already had a discussion around that, unless someone is going to make that motion. So this is not, I don't want to have the big open discussion. We had that at our last retreat. This is about whether you want to take any of these off, or whether there's any ones you want to substitute. TJ.
We have 11 questions here. There's only 4 that I want to just talk about and hit it. One is under the students, question number 2, I feel valued by the adults at my school. I'd definitely be open to I just feel valued at my school. Because I think if we're talking about climate, we're talking about how students are treating each other as well as adults, and admittedly, we have more direct control of how adults treat students, but in general in climate. So if anyone else is, I'm not gonna fight that one, but I'll put a suggestion out there if other people take it. And then number 4, particularly on the students, one of the things that at Gloria's committee, the Committee on Behavior, one of the people from Glendale, I think it was Sarah from Glendale, talked about students taking the climate survey, and talked about fourth and 5th graders and how the interpretation of some of these questions is very, very difficult for them, and the language and concepts. And walking up to a 4th grader and saying, "Do you see that your history and culture reflected at your school?" Is going to almost certainly create some confusion, and particularly among our students who unfortunately we have students who are struggling with literacy in 4th and 5th grade. So I really think we need something. We need a simpler way to get it. Conceptually, I'm okay with it, but we need simpler language, particularly for the student question on that. And I think that talking to 4th and 5th grade teachers to preview language would be a really, really good idea. So that's my comments.
Okay, good. Dean, any comments?
Those are great comments. When I get the results of these, I really don't know how to react to it. When we do the climate surveys, it's a tool that we have, but when Nancy or Alex goes to the school, can we develop something for them with the principals and the staff to get a much more of a subjective view of, how you feel?
Okay, so Dean, you know what? It's 7:30. I'm not saying that's not a good topic. It's just not the topic for tonight. Okay.
I'd like to see more of a personal touch.
Okay.
I'd like to see a report on that. Frankly, this doesn't help me that much.
Okay.
No comment.
Okay, Gloria?
No comment.
Am I? Okay, TJ, I would like to keep the I feel valued by the adults at my school. I just think that it gets at a certain thing that we do have a greater control in. And I agree, the valued by everyone is also a measure. I feel that's sort of I belong at school. How do my classmates make me feel? How's the general all thing? I feel we don't have anything here that right now points to the relationship with adults, and that to me is the one that makes the most sense. Okay, Kate, we're final. You're the last comment. We're just moving through, or I'm going to make a motion for approval.
Make a motion. It's all good. I am only one vote, so.
Great. I will move that the Board of Education approve the climate survey power questions recommendations for goals 2 and 3 as set forth in the document prepared for the special meeting dated November 12th, 2018.
Second.
I'd like to amend to pull out the history and culture. I don't think I don't think that's going to give us any useful information from many of our students. I think it's too complex a question.
TJ, what about making an amendment that be?
I wish I had language, and I don't. That's
Say that again, TJ?
I wish I had language to make a suggestion right now, and I don't.
Number 4.
Yeah, I mean, and
This one.
For the fourth grade student is what you're talking about.
I see my history and culture reflected in my child's in my school, in my child's school. Again, I'm looking at 4th, 5th, and 6th graders struggling with that conceptually, and yeah.
So he's looking, and I think we all kind of agree that there's an elementary version that might be worded differently, particularly around this one issue which he highlighted really nicely. But we hadn't thought about that. There isn't one survey that a 4th grader should be doing the same one as a mod. I think that so. Can we make an elementary version for that question?
Can I just mention, I mean, I'm not thinking that I know and I can think back being 4th and 5th and 6th graders, but when you are a person of a different culture in history, you know early on that you don't quite fit in, and I guess, you know, I don't know if we have to explain it differently, but I can expect that the child feels it already.
And
you already know, I mean,
my
but
point is whether this question is going to evoke those feelings and remind students and get them to answer it. And again, you know, just I've descriptions of students taking these. It's you know, what does this mean? What does this mean?
I say
well,
let's
then we have
try
to.
it.
Yeah, let's
Let's
try it.
Yeah.
Explain
And
it
let's
to
see what
them.
happens.
Change it next year.
Yeah, let's try it. Okay.
I'm going to move to, if any seconds, to remove the word, I see my culture reflected in my school, remove history, and remove those words. To simplify it slightly. If there's a second, there's a second.
So it's
So
I
you
see
would-
my
whoops.
culture.
Yeah, I would see
I see my
history,
culture reflected in my school.
My culture.
Mm-mm.
Just
Yeah, I
second.
don't agree with that.
Okay, with regards to the amendment, it has been moved and seconded. All in favor of the amendment?
It was seconded?
Aye.
What?
What?
It's removing for the student, question number 4 is removing my history, or reviewing
Reviewing
history
history
and to say, I see my culture reflected in my school. Okay, all in favor of the amendment?
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Nay. Okay, the amendment fails. So the original motion, is there any other discussion on that? All in favor? Aye. Opposed?
Whoop, we forgot.
Aye.
Thank you, Amon. Thank you, Dean. Then that passes 6-0.
We don't know Robert's rules as well as
No. Okay, so I will move to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?